Okay, on our Okra car, we are upgrading to some Marshall, much more improved headlights. So we're doing these for the outers, and we're doing the Marshall inners as well for this 4-headlight car. This is what was originally on there, some generic nondescript brand, but we're switching over to a much more sharper image, flat beam style cutting. It's one of the few upgrades that I really do prefer. However, if you are going to upgrade lights, that is a perfect opportunity for you to really go through the electrical system for your lighting. It just happens to be on this Okra car, there is some fried wires in there for the headlights, and it turns out it looks like it's just a lot of poor grounding and loose connections. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going through, I'm making a harness that comes from here into the headlight bucket, and I'm soldering the ends. So I'm doing it for a couple reasons. One, when these set screws pinch down on a soldered terminal, they tend to have a cleaner, longer lasting connection. I'm also switching over to a bullet style connector for the butts. That in conjunction with making sure that the grounding system, which is the biggest culprit for wiring to fry, is typically not the supply voltage, it's the grounding circuit. If it's getting weak, loose, or it's just simply not a high enough quality wire, that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to start frying the wire. So we naturally start to assume it's something to do with supply voltage. And again, if we have electrical issues, first thing I would do is go look at what the grounding system looks like. One of the highest loads in the electrical system of the car is the headlights. So it stands to reason that it's also the most probable area for electrical issues. So it's just one of those things that don't assume that it's just something as obvious as the supply voltage, as well as it could be just simply the ground or in poor shape. Because what can happen is you can have the 12 volts carrying onto this and something not working, or it works really weak. You assume it's a poor connection on the high spot, which it could be, but quite honestly, it could just be something as simple as dirt and grime has got between the contact for the common, or the ground I should say, and the surface which is grounded too. That is every bit as important as the actual supply voltage. After all, it completes a circuit. Here's one of the grounds that I am about to install on one of these headlights. The end is soldered, bullet connector on the side with the heat shrink on it. The heat shrink actually fuses to the line. This makes it a very solid connection that will last forever. These little things certainly go a long way, and when you want to talk about the quality of a headlight and the overall casting ability, the circuitry to it is just as important as the actual headlight itself. And these particular bullet leads come with this pre-formed on it heat shrink. What's nice about this stuff is when it fuses to the wire, it really bonds very well. Probably a little bit better than most stuff you could buy at a store. So, those heat shrink around, this is not where I'm going to end this. We are going to next solder the bullet in just to ensure that connection doesn't loosen up over time. There's one thing about electricity, as it travels through wiring, if there is a connection that is weak, it heats up. And when it heats up, it loosens up. So we want to go through every bit of the effort we can to ensure that we have the most well-developed connection we can make out of this. point where we get the doors finally aligned and to never be touched again. We spoke earlier about setting the door, setting the latch, making sure everything was in proper alignment before you put the gaskets on. And then you put the gaskets in and work it from there. Now this one's pretty much at that point. But this is actually something completely different we're going to talk about. We've been doing this for a long time. And for the most part, everybody has went through their phases of what color something should be. For the longest time, every GTV seemed like it had to be 501 red or a variation of that red for somebody to be happy. And then people started thinking, well, I kind of like the blues. And they started working with blues. And then sometimes silvers came out, which I'm certainly not a fan of on a GTV. And now we're starting to get into more interesting concepts people are doing. For example, white on a GTV is always a really nice color. Of course, until you put the chrome on it and the wheels and everything else, it kind of has a somewhat standard feel to it. But it gets immensely intriguing the minute you start hanging the bright work back on the car. It comes to life and has a very different feel to it, and it's a really, really flattering color when done right. Now we've done several variations of white, and some of the alpha whites historically are not that complimentary. There's one or two out there that were late 60s whites that were, quite frankly, boring. But this color, this is a color that here in light, and the reason we have the lights off so you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like, is if it had all the lights on, you would think this was day glow color, and it's not. It's actually very grayish white. So we turned off some of the lights so you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like. What's nice is customers are starting to put a lot of thought in what they want the car to look like, whether they want it to be a little more exotic feeling or if they want it to have a little more traditional feel or a slight touch of something different. In this particular case, this car is heading into a very different direction than what it started. This car has been in the shop for a very long time and has since changed hands, and now it's in the hands of a new owner who has really thought through what he wants it to look like. It's going to have a simplistic but sporty appearance exterior, and it's going to have somewhat elegance to it on the interior. We're going to be using chocolate brown leathers and things like that. This thing's going to look really, really nice when it's done. And it's one of those things, when you first apply white on a car, it really has a very drab feel to it. But the minute you put the clear coat on it, it starts to take on a whole new light. So I'm kind of excited about this one turning the corner. This car has been extensively modified. We have reinforced welded everything. We have changed out the floors. We have changed out the rockers. We have changed out the lower sections of the quarter panels. We have reinforced everything, and this car is essentially a very rigid chassis. So this car is well prepared for it to have a rather lively driving experience. And so now we turn the corner and we are starting to look forward to putting it together. Okay, so we changed out the rear end of this car a while ago. This was a part of some really great footage we had for you, but unfortunately the footage is lost. However, in the process of changing out the rear end, we put in this brand new, completely redone, limited slip rear end in this 69 GTV. Also, you have to keep in mind, the limited slip rear end is a 2-liter rear end. That means that the bolts that come from the drive shaft to the actual differential are 9mm bolts, and they're exceptionally special bolts. We've talked about this before. We're going to talk about it one more time real quickly. These bolts are very special, not only shouldered, but very hardened, special bolt, okay? And when you put the 1600-1750 drive shaft up to it, this is a different size bolt. So however, that is a little bit of an issue because you want to make sure you're using the exact right drill bit, because you don't want a lot of slop in the hole that you're making to drill out to fit this through this to this. Okay, now if I were to use the original bolts that came with the drive shaft, they would be undersized for the limited slip and you would have a little bit of play. That is a problem. So if you don't have these really special bolts somebody's taken off your car, like for example this car, somebody changed out all these bolts. Instead of them being 10.9 very special hardened bolts. They were using 8.8, which in domestic values, that's about a grade 5 or SA5 bolt. That's bad news, because this takes a lot of beating. This needs to be an exceptionally hard bolt. He didn't have them in this car, so you can now order them. However, with that said, they are very expensive. We're talking like a fine night out of dining expensive. In other words, just changing out these four will set you back about 60 bucks. Changing out both the rears and the fronts, that'll set you back 120 bucks. It's 8 bolts. 8 bolts that'll set you back 120 bucks. But it's really a must-have. So with that said, that segues into our next thing. A lot of you are asking us about the carbon fiber drive shaft we have coming. It's in production now. We should hopefully have it very, very soon. When I say soon, I mean like within the next week or two. And you'll see what that's all about, because our whole objective is we want to get rid of the 2-piece drive shaft altogether. Now when you put a drive shaft back on, 2 things you want to do. One, ideally you want to put it back into the mated form it came from. In other words, there should be witness marks as where this thing was disassembled. That way when you put it back together, you make sure you're putting it together the way it was, because it was at one point in time balanced that way. And if the car didn't give you any wicked vibrations, you have to assume it was still balanced. Okay, so with that said, when you go to tighten these down, not only do you rotate out what you're bolting down, but you also want to use feeler gauge to make sure you're miking them down equally so the mating surfaces come into alignment tightly and squared. Which is what we're going to do here. I'm not going to bore you with that because that's kind of straightforward stuff. Seems like at some point in time, just about every alpha owner essentially wants one of these. Unfortunately, in this part of the world, they're becoming increasingly more difficult to find. More so, becoming more difficult to find in relatively good shape. This is a car that I owned. I've owned this car for, well, almost 10 years. And the owner of it now essentially wants to bring it back to life and is wanting to do it in a modest kind of way. Because the interior of this car is so nice, it doesn't need to be modified or fixed or any attention drawn to it. We're just focusing on the outside. But because the car had somewhat suspicious body work done to it, he elected to have the outside blasted, so we're starting from a raw condition. And I'm actually fairly surprised how clean and non-rusty this car is. So we're actually kind of excited about going forward on this car. When you saw this car come in, when we brought it back from the blasters, you notice it was wrapped in plastic. Essentially, once a car has been blasted, you can't touch that surface until you put something on it. This right here is an acid etching process. It is really transparent. You can actually see that it almost looks like there isn't anything on there or a very light coat of it. The reason that is because we want to be able to do metal work, but acid doesn't necessarily get better with more on there. In fact, it's more effective in a very light coat. Let it do its job. It will stop doing its job the minute you start putting material over the top, be it primers, sealers, body fillers, it essentially stops its etching process. So it's going to stay like this for a few days, and then we'll get going on it. Okay, so what we're getting ready to do today is we're going to start the process of painting some magnesium Ferrari wheels. These are a fairly rare set of 16-inch Ferrari wheels that are very near and dear to the customer's heart. So a lot of times the process of painting magnesium is a bit of an elusive task to people because they don't realize that it's not like painting aluminum or anything else. Magnesium is a very different breed of metal. What it does is it heats up and it contracts at extraordinary rates in which it can make paint reject. Plus it's also a very unique non-ferrous metal. So it doesn't like to have paint adhered to it very well. So there is solutions, there is a process in which you can make that survive. But being Ferrari wheels, you know how finicky Ferrari people can be, and probably rightfully so. So what we have to do is every step of the process is something that has to be somewhat thought out because you don't want to change the behavior, the characteristics of the wheels. Okay, so if we were to sand all the paint that was on them and get this down to its bare minimum, we still wouldn't be at the actual metal because the substrates of the metal would still have basically the primers that were used prior to in the pores, and probability for rejection would still be fairly high. Plus, you can't just use any kind of media on them if you plan on trying to blast them to their original surface. And some of the other cryogenic kind of concepts are a little bit concerning because there's no track record that dry ice and things like that would work. But again, our biggest concern is we have to get to the substrate. We have to get the previous paints out of it. So what was used was a particular style of plastic media, and it got all the way down to the original casting. So you see this unique swirling effect in here. This could be one of a multitude of things. This could be either original castings that are just starting to show the foundry issues, or I should say the foundry marks, or it can just simply be that the previous paints and primers didn't really etch in there, and those are the processes of where it was passing or failing in its process. So we're starting from scratch. And when you do magnesium, you have to treat it like nothing else. It is a completely different process. First of all, once you get them down to their actual bare core metal with no paint on them like we are right now, they have to be cleaned exceptionally well. Okay, because again, we have to get everything out of the pores of the paint. So right now, Ariel is using wax and grease remover. Once that process is done, these are blown completely dry, and we have to move on to the next steps. And that is, we have to use a aluminum and magnesium cleaner. This is sprayed on, it bubbles to the surface, and it gets all the contaminants out. Then you have to go into a metal conversion. Okay, this is a very unique stuff, and it's kind of hard to get anymore because it's not really needed all that much. But you have to use metal conversion onto the metal in order for it to be prepared for an adhesion of the next step, which is going to be a light coat of an epoxy on it. But that epoxy is not really there for any other reason other than to kind of level off the surface from all these interesting foundry marks that are in these wheels. Once we cut that down, then it's ready for the painting process. Now, Ferrari wheels are a very unique color that essentially can't be second guessed, and it is an actual paint code by Ferrari. It's Ferrari 101C. Okay, it's an argent silver. Then it brings you to the last step. Last step is you can't just leave them in a single application with no clear coat protection on them, but they're not supposed to be glossy. They're supposed to have a semi-matte finish to it. So we use this. This is a very special spray as it is, clear coat that is meant for motorcycle engine blocks. It has a fairly matte finish, and it won't give you a whole lot of luster, which in effect is what these wheels are supposed to be, not very lustered. And so that's the whole process, and it takes quite a bit of time to get from there to here. Some of the essential rules with handling magnesium is when you have the bare metal in place, you cannot handle it with your hands. It's essential that you get them into the special cleaning solution to raise the impurities out of the surface. Then you have to put the zinc conversion coating on it. And then you have to put the zinc conversion coating wash over the top of it. Okay, that's the three phases, and that's why it starts to darken up, is because it now has a light coat of zinc over the top of it. Now where we're going from here is we are going to use a chromate epoxy. We're not using acids. We're using a chromate epoxy to put over top of the surface. Now it's difficult for you to see from your position, but there is an awful lot of foundry cast marks in these that need to come out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to run 2 coats of the epoxy. We're going to let them sit for at least 3-4 days, just like that, undisrupted. And then we're going to sand them down a little bit. Not a whole lot. We're not going to cut through it. We're just trying to smooth and level out the surface. And then we're going to put our 101 Ferrari Argent and Silver over the top of them. And then we're going to use the motorcycle engine clear coat. The reason we're using that is for a couple of things. One, it is highly durable. 2, it has a matte finish to it. These wheels are not supposed to be glossy at any capacity. And that's kind of one of those things you see that's a little bit of a misstep. In the paint world, we're always tempted to look for luster. However, you're not supposed to see luster in very certain places. Most places, you don't see it. You don't see it in the engine bay. And you most certainly don't see it on the surface of these particular wheels. The other thing we have to do is the back sides of these and the lug nut sleeves have to be taped off. We don't want any of the epoxies or paints or anything like that on those because it's not supposed to be there. Magnesium wheels are very seriously reactive to the mating surface, so the back sides of these need to be very clean and no paint on them. That way when they're mounted to the hub of the brake, it's a flush finish because magnesium does distort and it can be easily influenced by deviations at its surface. So that's where we're at. Next thing you're going to see is we're going to start applying 2 coats of a chromate epoxy. Okay, so we didn't really follow the build of these as well as we should have because we got very busy around here. But the Ferrari magnesium wheels are now at the point where they're almost ready for color. They're in this green chromate epoxy, which is very difficult to get in most parts of the country, for that matter, most parts of the world, because it's not exactly an environmentally friendly material. However, so when we first applied the chromate epoxy over these wheels, it was after we'd done a zinc conversion on them. We had coated them through several different kinds of baths, which turned the wheels black, as you've seen in the earlier parts of the video. So now we're at this point where we've had the epoxy on. When they dried, we can still see the foundry marks or foundry castings, which is that wrinkling effect that it had. You can see them quite clearly in most of the wheels, so we had to apply another round of epoxy. Now when we applied that second round of epoxy, the whole point was to try to fill in those, because we're going to have to sand almost all of it off, because we don't want a lot of material on these. Ferrari guy's kind of funny. He wants to be able to see the Ferrari logo's there. He wants to see the size of the wheels on there, and if you start adding a lot of paint material on there, that disappears. So we have went through 3 rounds of epoxy on these, and now we're on our last step, and today these are going to get colored. Now Jacob, what he's going to do, you'll see in a few minutes, is he's going to apply epoxy only where we got cut through. Cut through is where the metal is showing. So we're going to seal those in, which is an essential part of the magnesium wheels. You've got to get them completely encapsulated. If you don't encapsulate them, they will gas on you, which creates that wrinkling effect. That's why you see the entire wheel is coated, not just the surface of the top and the surface of the backside. The entire wheel needs to be in that shell, so to speak. So Jacob's going to explain to you everything he did to get to this point. Okay?
All right, just like Darren was saying earlier, after we had them blasting and stuff and we coated them with the first coat of epoxy, you can see all those foundry casting markings on there. And obviously it's going to show through the paint. So what we did is, like I said, we sanded it down, reapplied some more epoxy and sanded it down to get all that fine groove. We used about a 320 grit, stepped it up a little bit to 400, and then scuffed them with a red Scotch-Brite to get them nice and smooth and take away those wrinkling marks. So, like I said, we're just going to apply one coat of thin coat of epoxy right here, just where the metal is showing, which is very minimal. There's not too much left on these with the metal showing, but we're going to do that to make sure that the paint after this epoxy adheres to it and it's a nice clean finish and everything's nice and sealed.
Okay, so we're pulling up the paint for the Ferrari wheels. And the nice things about having the software that has essentially every paint code in the world is that we can pull up the formulations that are either A, factory original formulations, which, you know, Sikkens being one of the key companies in Europe at the time that was doing this. And we know that our tones, especially with metallics, we know that our tones are going to have the right hue when casted. The only other thing that has to be somewhat conscientious when you're painting a wheel is to not glam it up. It's something we kind of, you know, have a tendency to do anymore. But these wheels were never a shiny wheel. They weren't supposed to take away from the style lines of the car. They're supposed to have a semi-satin finish to them. So we're going to use a very special motorcycle engine block clear coat. Not only is it exceptional to heat, but it also has a semi-matte finish to it, just like these wheels would have had. The only caveat to this and get a little dicey is that sometimes when you use these type of clear coats, they have an overly flat finish to them. So we're going to have to play with it. Now, I pulled up my formula, and I'm sending it over to the computer on the mixer so I know exactly how to pour this off. You know, a lot of these paints are heavily influenced by as much as a tenth or a hundredth of a gram. So when you're making a small amount, like we are, because we're only making it for these wheels, the slightest off on the measurements can throw the whole color off the lot. So you have to be careful. Certain colors have more influence over the effects than others. Now this particular color has metallic silver, deep black, white transparent gray, and a fine bright metallic. That's the four components that are in it. And they're not effectively in the same scale, but we're only using 7/10 of a gram. Excuse me, we're only using 7/10 of a gram of the deep black. So that tells you if you're only using that little, it affects an awful lot. Here we go. Now I'm going to print out a label for the can. That's it. Okay, so here's our magnesium Ferrari wheels. This is what they're supposed to look like. They're not supposed to have that brilliant, deep, wet, clear coat finish on them. They're supposed to have somewhat of a matte finish, just like you see here. And that's what we've done. So it's a long process. It's a pain in the butt, to be honest with you, sometimes to get magnesium to bond well with the painted products. But we've achieved it. We expect nothing less than, you know, long time of usable time with these. Here we go.